Battle scenes. Battle scenes are a great way to add conflict, tension, to add action, to heighten emotion. But when I am reading, I often skim through the battle scenes. I'm talking about battle scenes mostly in the context of fantasy books. Fantasy is well known for fighting, either like single combat or big epic battles, and those battles serve a purpose. The fighting is there for a reason. I think there are a few main reasons to have those fight scenes, and I think if those reasons aren't there, then what is the point? I have 4 main points in my notes, but I kind of feel like my first 2 points go together, so I'll go over those first. I think the main reason to include battle in a fantasy book is for the conflict. A story needs conflict or it's boring. What's the point? Most good stories aren't happening during peacetime. When everything is great and happy and wonderful, that's great for the people in the story, that's great for us in our lives, but it's not as interesting. If I was telling you about a vacation I went on and I said it was great, we had a great time, got home safe, I would have had a great vacation, but I probably would have bored you telling about it. Or you go on vacation to see family, you all get along, great. Versus you go on a vacation to see family and there's fighting and drama. One of those is happier, one of those is more interesting. Conflict can happen in a lot of different ways. It's not necessarily the conflict of good versus evil on a large world or universe scale. Sometimes it's smaller, 2 rival houses against each other. Sometimes it's even smaller, 2 people against each other. But the conflict creates interest, and a battle can bring that conflict to a head. And my second point that I think just fits in with the first point kind of perfectly is that a battle or a fight makes us, the reader, choose a side. Or, on the smaller scale, choose a character. We get our emotions involved and we have someone that we want to root for. We want to see one of those sides win. We get pulled in. So point 1, conflict. Point 2, involve me, the person reading the book, in the conflict, get me involved, get me to care about one of those sides, and I'll be much more interested in the outcome of that battle. My third point, and I think this is applicable to books and also to film, is that a battle or a fight scene can add the cool factor, just to be epic, to have the fun of watching it. I also think it's a really good way to show what a character is capable of or what they have learned along the way. I especially think this is good for things like fantasy or science fiction because they have ways to fight that us mundane mortals don't have. A battle scene with elves flinging magic or magic swords or the Force and lightsabers, any of that adds a cool factor that wasn't there before. It's also a great way to show the payoff of someone who's been learning or training for a long time during a story. You get to see them use those skills they've been gaining to go and beat the bad guy that's been looming all this time. And my fourth point is that a battle scene or a fight scene can add action and excitement. This is the one where I think books get into trouble. It's the one that I think works better for film than for books. Anytime that the action of a fight is being described and you have to read word for word, you have to read that they swung their sword and then the other person ran off to hide in a building and shoot their arrow out the window. The more that's described, the more it slows down that action, and the more that the action is being described, the less exciting it is. The less conflict is involved, the less emotion is involved. When it's just action being described, there's no plot happening, there's no character development happening. Plot, character development can be included in fight scenes. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just about the action. Those are the scenes that I find myself skimming. If there's 2 characters that have been friends their whole life, suddenly they're on opposite sides and now they have to fight. I'm not invested in that fight because I want to watch them fight. I'm invested in that fight because of the emotion. They never wanted to fight and now they have to. Scenes like that are just about the action and not about anything else can work well in film because film is so visual. You can have music, sound effects. I'm thinking of like Marvel movie action scenes, Star Wars, you have the lightsabers, watching a Jedi hold out their hand and something goes flying. It looks cool, but having it described in a book is not as cool as seeing it. So if the point of the battle or the fight is just for action, I think it has to be dealt with very carefully in book form to not be boring. I think that a battle scene has to be about so much more than just the fight. It has to be about why they're fighting. What will one side gain or lose from this fight? A fight scene is a really good way to show a character being tested, whether it's physically testing them or emotionally, because that character in a battle can suffer pain and loss, and that's a big deal. It can also challenge a character's ideals. Like, what do they fight for? Once they're in the fight, is what they're doing worth it to them on a personal level? And again, we, the reader, can be emotionally tested reading a fight scene, reading about that big battle, because a character that we have come to care about might not make it through. And I kind of feel like that's probably the best use of a fight or a battle in a book, is getting the reader drawn in to where I am invested. I need to know what happens at the end. So I have some examples. I am going to try to talk about these examples in a very general fashion to not give spoilers. So if you have not read them, they won't be spoilers. And then if you have read them, you'll know what I'm talking about. The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. My personal opinion is that that is the best of the Stormlight books so far. And that ending, the big crescendo, the conflict at the end. Sanderson is known for what's called the Sanderlanche, where there's a whole bunch of action saved up for the end. That fight has cool scenes showing what characters are capable of. It shows characters having really deep internal conflict. They don't know what to do, but they must act. And by that time in the story, you are so intensely invested in a side or in a character, you can't wait to get to the end. You have to know how it ends. You have to know what happens, who survives. I think that battle at the end of The Way of Kings is a really good example of what I'm talking about. I also just finished The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang, and that has a couple of good examples of, in the fighting, there's a couple of characters, one who has been learning, and he has to show that he is just as capable in the battle as the older generation who have been doing this their whole life, or who have been practicing and testing their skill their whole life. And then there's another character who used to know how to fight, who has not for a long time, and then has to kind of pull up that old skill and that old passion to protect the people they love. I was also thinking about The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, specifically at the end of the book Eldest. That has a few different elements that make it really good. One is that a lot of that book is spent with a character learning how to fight, how to push through pain, how to use magic, and then you get to see the culmination of all that work getting paid off. There's also a super personal fight at the end with an emotional revelation. If you know, you know. But there's also the large scale kind of good versus evil, this side versus this side, the rebels versus the empire. And I really appreciate how it has the large scale down into the small scale all in the same battle, because you're rooting for a side, but also for a person. And then let's think of the most classic, The Lord of the Rings. The fate of Middle-earth hangs in the balance. And so everyone who fights is fighting for survival, for the world that they know, but each of those characters has a more personal reason to fight. Gandalf has been alive for a very long time. He's been fighting the darkness for a very long time, but he never tires. He never wearies of the fight, or if he does, he pushes through and keeps going. He sees more of the big picture, but he's also gotten his feelings wrapped up in those little hobbits, and he cares about them personally too. You have Aragorn, whose feelings are more wrapped up in this kingdom that's his inheritance that he's fighting for, even though it's not his yet. He's kind of laying aside his own personal pride and ambition and still fighting for what he feels is his responsibility. He still puts himself out there to protect it. Then you have Legolas and Gimli. They're not there because the elves and the dwarves are involved in this fight. They know that the big picture, Middle-earth, that matters. Their people still live there, but for them, they're fighting for their friends. Merry and Pippin have gotten so much more involved than they ever planned to. I think in their hearts they are really fighting for Frodo to make it to the end. And then Éowyn, her fight is so much different than all the men who are fighting. She feels like she has a lot to prove. And then, of course, Theoden King. He was not fully invested in this fight. He never would have taken his niece. But when he went, he took everything he had and he was going to fight to the fullest. And is it spoilers to say that he gives his life for the cause? How long does something have to be out before spoilers matter? Fights are important in stories. If you are a fantasy reader, that idea of being drawn in to characters fighting for people they love, for causes they believe in, that pulls us in, that makes us care. And I think that's why it's so disappointing when it's not well done, because it falls flat and it feels like, what was the point of that? Okay, without spoilers, what's one of your favorite fight scenes? In a book or movie? I'm definitely going to go with the ending of The Way of Kings for mine.